Justin, my LinkedIn feed is out of control with all this AI agent stuff. Can you please explain the difference between the hype and the reality with all these agents?
Gladly, Tom. There is so much hype. It's almost more confusing than AI itself. Like the hype and snake oil around AI models and AI's capabilities, like agents. Everyone's calling everything an agent, and I think you probably see this too. Of half these things are just automated workflows with some business logic in them. Um, the reality of agents is that they are here, they are very capable, but you have to go about building them in a certain way, and you have to set expectations that it still is relying on the foundational frontier models of AI. And so the ability to get more work done with agents is very real, but the outputs of those agents still have to be fine tuned based on the capabilities of the actual AI model itself. So there is a lot of hype around, I would say, I've seen a few folks claim that they're running their trading, their day trading, or their financial, you know, management on an agent, and that is not the case. But there are folks who are doing things like, when we add a new lead to our CRM, we want you to go out and do a series of things to search for information on that lead, their company, their market, their competitors, public testimonials or reviews or case studies, whatever it might be. That kind of stuff where a human would have to go to 5 different places and use their mental bandwidth to kind of distill all this information that they're finding and bring it into cohesive summary. That kind of stuff is very real. So what a lot of what people have seen with OpenAI's deep research, um, that's kind of agentic, as in the background, it's going around and doing a lot of things for you. Um, but there's not a lot of control over that. So that's a very basic agent, so to speak, in terms of what it's doing on the background. What you and the as the user see as end result is a nice formatted report. But that is kind of the difference between the hype and reality. I would say if agents right now is it's not going to completely take over doing things for you when they have to have a really accurate 100% confident in the information and inputs and outputs. But it can go and gather a bunch of stuff. It can go take simple information from one place, put in another, or get information from one place and digest that and kind of summarize it in different ways. That's definitely an oversimplification, but at a high level, that's what I would say the difference is between the hype and reality right now.
Do you think we'll actually get to the hype though? Like the marketing promise of just give me a fluffy task and the AI will go figure out the places to look, right? You're not saying go to LinkedIn to find somebody's LinkedIn. You're not saying go to their website to find a case study. You're just saying here's a person and tell me everything I need to know about it. Like do you think we'll actually realize the reality matching the hype at some point maybe this year?
Oh yeah, I think so this year. I think the big turning point was the reasoning models. So OpenAI's O1, DeepSeek, since the chain of thought, as in what the AI is quote unquote thinking as it's doing these tasks, you can see that. And so, if a good example, if folks want to check it out to see how these things can work better, how they are working better, is using Perplexity's deep research, because that's using DeepSeek's R1 reasoning model. And you can go type in, do some research for me on XYZ, and it chain of thought will show you that it is thinking for itself. If you're giving it something pretty vague of, this company, find out lots about it, its history, its leadership team, whatever it is, and you can see that vague of an ask, it's thinking through, well, what industry are they in? What context should I give about this industry? What are their use cases and their case studies? That kind of thing. The reasoning is a big win this year. So that is already well on its way and being integrated into the agentic approach, and that's making them way better. I think the biggest thing is better access to different data sources internally for
Mhm.
teams, because a lot of how people are building public agents is using kind of public data. They become very powerful when you can connect them to your own systems and keep them kind of secure and compliant within your own four walls. And
Yeah.
then the final big thing that I think is a challenge across frontier models in AI that will make agents a very real reality is the context windows. Because if it is, going through dozens of websites and the equivalent of hundreds of pages of documents, it can still lose the plot. And can not piece together all the things in all the right ways because the context windows, as in the you can view it as the RAM in a computer for AI, fills up pretty quickly still. So those two
Yeah,
things
there's a
solved will help.
couple components of that I just want to like refine or add to there. Like reasoning is basically the the AI model breaking the problem down into a couple different problems, or basically asking itself a couple more prompts in addition to whatever you prompt it, right? It's just really expanding on whatever it is you gave it to begin with. And we call it reasoning and thinking because that's the best parallel, that the best language that we have as humans to like use to articulate what these models are doing is, you know, technically they're just asking, using more tokens, asking more questions, and using that to create a richer answer. In the context window, it's so funny, you know, the context window really matters. Like you're, if you can only remember the last, you know, 2 days of life, your life is going to be very different than if you can remember the last 50 years, right? And the
Great
quality of
analogy.
that memory matters. And that's like
Yeah.
literally what we're talking about when we talk about a context window. It is how well can the AI remember the previous 100 messages or whatever, the previous 100 websites that they look at. Um, and a couple of these models have huge context windows compared to an R1 or even an OpenAI. Like the Google's latest model has a much larger context window than some of the other models. And it's interesting when we're talking about agents, naturally when you go through the work of building an agent, I think we talked a little bit last time, it might have been offline, about your use of N8N and the ability to just like swap an agentic automation with a different model because you just decided to use a different model, right? Like you can just click on a different one in the drop down if you want to do that. But how do you actually think through which model you want to use for the agent? And do you always have that kind of flexibility? Because there are like coded agent models and no code agent models. And do you always have that freedom when you're building a model to, or building an agent, to choose your model?
You do. It kind of comes down to the two first questions I think anyone should ask is, do I have the technical
Yeah.
resources to build this, or is it, maybe folks from more of a non-technical background who understand the no code space, and then what do I need to build with it? If it's something that is extremely complex with a ton of minutia in the business logic or the inputs and outputs of data points, you might want to lean towards kind of a code framework. But most cases can be built with no code. So tools like Gumloop, Relay, Lindy, Relevance. There's a bunch of others, but a lot of these tools you can use. I would say for probably 75% of use cases that your average person has. The big thing is that in both cases, you can customize which model, AI model it uses. So back to your point on context windows and whatnot, there's
Yeah.
also, we can share it in the show notes, but I sent you the model performance versus context length graph of the formal research
Yeah.
that's been done. And the claims of context window sizes increasing might be true, as in, something that could have done 32,000 tokens, and people can think of tokens as letters that it's sorting through, which is an oversimplification, but I encourage folks to go research what tokens and context windows are. Um, but the increase in context windows has not meant that that entire context window has the same performance throughout. So most
Mm.
context windows start trailing off around 8,000, 16,000 tokens. So Google claiming that they have 2 million is a bit of a misnomer, because the memory does not, the quality of the memory, like you were talking about, does not, it's not the same at token 1 as it is at token 2 million. It starts to trail off, or usually around 32 to 64,000 tokens. So 2 million is a bit of a misnomer. It's an
Marketing
improvement.
teams, man. Marketing
I love
teams.
them. But point being, back to the kind of how you apply those different models and agents, I think the coolest part about agent, whether you're using code and you're swapping out an API call, or you're using no code and you're literally toggling which provider, the cool thing I think is that with agents, once you build the framework and you build the overall um, agentic system, so to speak, as in what is its inputs, its outputs, what is the task that it's doing, you can swap out the AI models that it's using to do all of that very easily. So it's kind of like you built the you brought furniture into a house, but you can change all the walls at any time that you want. It's kind of the equivalent to being that easy. Obviously, real life isn't that easy, but the way that these are
Sure.
built, you can use OpenAI as your model and your agents, and then just like things we're seeing play out every week in the news. Let's say next week, Anthropic releases a new model, and that stays the leader for the next year, and you want to swap stuff out. It literally is a 15-20 minute job in a lot of cases to swap out the foundational models underneath and test them and whatnot. So the code versus no code route is something to start with as a question of what technical capabilities do we have to build this. And then from there, there's lots of different options. On the code side, they will refer to them as frameworks, and then on the no code side, it's usually straight up products that you would use, like a Gumloop, a Relay, Lindy, Relevance, etc.
Yeah, I think part of the code versus no code discussion is like, what what are you actually trying to do with the agent? Like, if this is a core product that you're building, you probably want to end up using code for that because it's just going to be a lot cheaper in the long run to run versus a no code approach. But if you're a customer success team and you're trying to use an agent to help you understand the the questions that you're getting inbound, a no code Gumloop or Lindy or Relay or Relevance, whatever, is going to be more than capable of doing that, and it's going to meet your team at their level of technical expertise, right? So the navigation between code no code, it's a lot less about the actual tool and a lot more about the makeup of your team that's trying to leverage the tool as a much more important component to consider. um, one of the things here that we just saw, was it yesterday actually, from Gumloop, is this like very open-ended agent approach. Tell me what you saw about this, because I just saw a post about it and just like a hype video. Have you had a chance to try it yet?
Not yet in the last 24 hours, but looking at the gist of it, like what it can do, I think a lot of use cases that people are building are because when they log into these agent no code agent platforms, it gives them a template or a use case and says do this. Gumloop is, I think, releasing the shackles and creating a much more kind of open, as in it's not this specific use case. It's think of all the use cases where you would have to have public search in it, or all the use cases where you would have it integrate with your own data. And they're quickly becoming kind of, call it flexible, like you can be with code, versus I think some of these platforms are very um, making you focus on, well, these are the integrations that we have. These are the ways that, or these are the use cases that you can build with those integrations. And I think Gumloop is quickly surpassing some others in terms of flexibility and the ability to do different things with it.
And you can still pick your different models, right? Like you can still pick whether you want to use GPT 4.0 or 4.0 mini or llama or whatever. um, but back to the model, underlying model conversation, there's a bunch of different criteria to think of when you're trying to pick a model, and certain models are actually designed or just better at categorical tasks, like ones that involve math or science or writing like a human. Like all of these different sort of these different types of tasks can be better or worse equipped to a certain model. So there is no, right now at least, there's not this one super model that GPT 4.0 is going to be the best at every individual thing. I know a whole bunch of people that prefer Claude. I know a whole bunch of people who like to do things locally, right? Like it's just a whole different ballgame when it comes to whatever work you're specifically doing with the model or the agent that you're developing. It's kind of a test and check environment right now. How else are you able to, like, how are you evaluating all these different models on the tasks that you're doing every day?
There's a lot of benchmarks and kind of public research that'll show you, like you said, which ones are best at math versus writing. And and whatnot. But the other thing too is that because you can swap models out easily, you can build an entire kind of agent flow of work for you. If we go back to that research example where it's pulling, public data and data that you might have, and it's looking at maybe a financial analysis of a deal to buy a company. So it's looking at the numbers. Do those make sense? But also the qualitative, going back to researching their website and their leadership team and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so the cool thing is that you could build that kind of example all with one model, and then you can swap out different parts of that kind of agentic flow of different tasks happening and try different models.
Mhm.
The other cool thing um, is that realistically, people should think about building an agent in the way you would think about building a team. Just like you wouldn't
Mm.
hire a marketing content creator or copywriter to do financial analysis, and you probably wouldn't hire a financial analyst to do, HR recruiting. You would hire the specific people for that. So you can swap out different parts of the agent flow because these are essentially a bunch of tasks that are being done and then brought back together for you as a deliverable in some shape or form. And so you could have, again, going back to that example we were talking about, I find OpenAI's O1 is because of its reasoning and its kind of structured output and input abilities, really good with math. Whereas personally, I find the outputs from Anthropic's Claude models to be better for writing. So in that example we were talking about, you could have the financial analysis being done by O1's model and the final output being sent to you being written by Anthropic's Claude model. And so you can change which parts you use. And the big thing is the cost is not going to be huge just because you're using different models. You're only using as much of that model as is needed for that task. There's
Mhm.
no kind of baseline cost. It's just per task that you run, you're only using, the parts of that model or the amount of API calls from that model that you need. So the cost, just because you're using a bunch of different AI APIs, doesn't mean that the cost is going to be much higher because you're using a few different ones, which is the cool part too.
And we're still talking about, fractions of pennies, right? Per
Yeah.
API call. Like, it's really not a ton of money, so long as you're pointing these AI models at something that moves the needle for you, right? You're not just having
Yeah.
it count number of messages you sent in Slack, right? You're having it do something constructive that can actually, create value for you and your team. So when you make sure you position it in a good way, I think the cost is pretty secondary. Now there's obviously a whole bunch of other costs. I think the very real human cost of, hey, I need to think through and set this thing up is extensive, right? If you're in a position at your company where you're trying to amplify the rest of your team, but you personally don't have enough time in a day to allocate a few hours to like learning gum loop or relay or uh, you know delegating a langchain project to somebody, like it's that's its own problem. But using the models itself, I think they when you use them the right way, they're still pretty constructive. um, Trust and
You have,
security, I've been getting
oh,
a couple questions about recently,
yeah.
unless you wanted to take it somewhere else.
Well, before we move on to, yeah, I guess trust and security obviously is a big one, but while we're kind of closing out talking about which tools to use, do you have a favorite top two that you would recommend?
Um, so I've been playing a lot recently with Relay, Lindy, and Gumloop. I haven't dug into Relevance. I'm actually planning on digging into Relevance on Monday. Um, but of those three, I actually have liked Relay.app the most so far, but I've also spent more time with it, and I think it's closest to Zapier, which I have the most experience building with. Just like the format of building with Relay is very similar to Zapier, but it gives you some like environmental variables, which is really nice, like the time of the run and stuff like that. And like there's some more specific LinkedIn focused agent abilities and some like web scraping research agent abilities that are really nice and like very simple. But I think anyone who's playing in this space right now sort of recognizes that Gumloop is a little bit more of a step up from Zapier or Make with regards to like agentic focused workflows. and I think I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time with Gumloop in the near future, just because of their mission and the way that they've like really changed their approach to building, sort of an automation or AI agent provider tool inside of this like stack and space that we're in right now. So I would probably say, Relay or Gumloop, but Lindy is just a couple code pushes away from being like right there too. Like all of these apps are pushing so much new functionality so quickly that by the time somebody listens to this, it might have already swapped. Like, by the time next week or something, there could be a whole new wave of models that drop, that, just change the whole discussion between GPT 4.0 or R1 or whatever and make them look like, last year's models.
Well, yeah, and 4.5 probably coming out next week, and 5 on the roadmap for probably the summer. Like it's yeah, same with the frontier model advancement happening quickly. I would say the software and the teams building in the agentic space is happening so fast. I am largely aligned with you on in the no code side. I'm really enjoying what Gumloop is doing. And I think Gumloop, Lindy, and Relay are all kind of on the right path in terms of knowing what the market's needing and building towards it, because Rome wasn't built in a day. And on the kind of more code side, I think there's some good frameworks like Crew and whatnot, but I really, really like Langflow. So Langflow kind of working off the LangChain side of things, but Langflow and N8N are probably the two that I like the most. N8N is just so capable, and it's got the no code, side handled really well. Why I really like Langflow, and why more technical folks should maybe give it a look, is it's really great with the kind of no code visual building of an agentic workflow. But each module in that workflow, you can literally hit a button that says code, and it shows you the actual code underneath, and you can edit that as well. So it's kind of best of both worlds. You can build stuff just like you would in others with no code in a visual way, but you could also control the code itself. So if I had to maybe pick three right now, it would be Langflow, N8N, and Gumloop.
I'm really surprised more product teams don't have that toggle. Like it just blows my mind that there's not like the code, no code toggle in so many more of these apps, because from a UX perspective, it's so nice to be able to go between those two, and I think it would just enable a whole bunch of teams where you have this like friction at an enterprise level between the really technical product teams and engineering teams that want things in code to be able to really fine tune, handle, and understand things, versus the CS teams, the marketing teams, the ops team, the finance team that is like never going to be reading the code, but need to be able to change some things occasionally. And I think N8N does have a real leg up with that. Especially because you can run it locally, which brings us back to the other point I wanted to ask you about: trust and security of the models specifically that you're using. And even with these code or no code tools, how are you able to stay secure and not just hand all your information over to any of these big companies? Just talk to me about trust and security. How have you helped companies navigate that process and avenue?
Yeah, I think a lot of people hear about, some sort of headline and or misrepresentation of how things work, and then they apply that to how everything works, and are fearful of how their data can be used. I think at the end of the day, most of these models are hosted by the provider that is made it, as in OpenAI. When you make an API call, it's going to OpenAI servers and running, that API or AI call for whatever you've asked for. Um, where people have become more concerned is the good example of DeepSeek coming out. DeepSeek has an API, but every time you send it an API call, it's going to a server in China that government might be monitoring there. But the big thing is who is hosting the model itself. And so if you are as sending your request to someone who is reputable, just like a Microsoft or a Apple has a terms of service, these companies are not going to say one thing publicly and then do something else, given the sheer amount of private data that is thrown their way. They, just like Microsoft and Apple for years, have said this is how it works. This is where you're sending your data to. This is our security. This is, expectations you can have. Same with the enterprise or business level, API calls with an OpenAI or an Anthropic. If you are using a tool like um, Gumloop or N8N is probably one of the best examples. One of the no-code tools, a lot of times you're using your own API key, which means that any request that you're sending directly to OpenAI using your OpenAI developer account. So you're not having a middle person take all of your data and store it and send it through
Uh-huh.
their developer account and doing who knows what with. You are in control of sending it back and forth. From there, you can choose kind of which version of hosting you're sending it to. So N8N as a agentic builder, you can host yourself. A lot of people use OpenAI, so you can use OpenAI's API. Microsoft also provides, because they've got that partnership. Azure being their cloud provider, OpenAI's APIs are hosted there anyways, but you can also go one step further and go through Microsoft only, and it's going through their servers. So again, it might seem like, oh, we're feeding it this data, but it's the same kind of thing as when you're opening, Google Sheets or Excel in the cloud. When you enter anything in the spreadsheet in those two systems, it's going to these two providers that are a walled garden and treat security very seriously. And same with the AI providers. So that's, again, overly simplified in a quick rundown, but to me, other than DeepSeek, or some random model that no one really knows where it came from, these firms are very reputable and they're handling the security very well, I think.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, too, it's what kind of information are you actually asking the AI to process? Right. You need to be in a particularly sensitive industry with handling particularly sensitive information and then decide, I want the AI to process all of this really sensitive information for me to really start to go into a gray area, or an area where you might want to consider self-hosting, if that is of interest. But even self-hosting these models and starting to self-host um, all of your sensitive data, like that comes with its own very real risks too, because chances are your security team is not going to be as robust as a Google or a Microsoft's security team. So that there's that consideration too. Are you really doing your customers a disservice for deciding to host your stuff yourself and rely on your own security engineers, however many you have, to build a secure environment for your information? So it's going to be a give and take either way. um, Trust and security kind of goes out the window with some of the news stories we have to talk about today.
Yeah.
But that is another conversation. I don't know if you want to get to the news because there was some pretty crazy news this past week.
Yeah, should we chat about, speaking of people that I wouldn't trust, Grok 3 was announced this week.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
so
pretty high up on the list of do not trust.
yeah, I think the model is impressive. They played catch up very quickly. So Grok 3, for those who aren't aware, if you're listening to this, you'd have to be interested enough that I'm sure you heard about it all. So the TLDR is XAI, which is Elon Musk's AI company, built off the back of a lot of what's going on at Twitter or X. Released Grok 3, which is their competitor to kind of the frontier models from OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, etc. They released something that still feels like it's playing catch up. So to me, the TLDR summary is that it is a good model. They've introduced reasoning. They've caught up to a lot of the frontier models. But those other frontier models are about to release big updates that'll eclipse them very quickly. The impressive thing is that XAI only started about 18 months ago in terms of playing catch up. And so things that took others years to build towards, they did in roughly about 18 months, which is impressive. But what they did not really make clear is their benchmarks, being competitive with frontier models. There's a lot of underlying assumptions that you'd have to make to believe it. And they, unlike again some of the other frontier models, they have not shown how they got to those results. So I, given its owner and his desire for misinformation, I trust a bit less. And then the big thing that, philosophy of ethics aside, they did not announce or release, I should say, they announced, but they did not release an API. So, your end users used to go to ChatGPT, and in this case, you would go to Grok's, front end user interface and type in a request and chat with it. But really, fundamentally, the big thing is, well, do you have an API for developers to integrate the system into their products, or for you to build, other flows around, whether that's automation or agentic or whatever it might be. And they announced it and said it's in the coming weeks it'll be released, which to me does not build a lot of confidence that they are truly ready to be a competitor for developers to integrate Grok 3 into their systems or their workflows or whatever it might be. So regardless of your your beliefs on the ethics of its owner, and his personality in public, regardless of that, I still did not see a strong case made, to use Grok 3 either as an end user in the chat interface or as a developer building into the back end of things. Not to mention, I just inherently don't trust what that data is going to be used for in the future.
Yeah,
And you never
definitely.
really know, but just like there's a long legacy of Microsoft, Apple, Google, not having these giant data leaks or things being repurposed just because the owner has a new whim that week. I don't think that'll be the case for Grok. I'd
I,
still trust it. So
yeah, I haven't used it. I've seen some of the benchmarks that are like underwhelming. Um, at the end of the day, I think it will be really interesting to see how either code or no code tools do or don't actually add it to the drop down, right? Because ultimately that is going to dictate so much traffic. Like Airtable AI or N8N or any of these systems that decide to say, okay, we're going to add Grok as a drop down for the model selection. Um, that's a big deal because that's how you immediately get so much traffic, from the API calls. But there's not an API, so it doesn't matter. And this whole thing is, hey, just go to whatever it is, grok.x.com or something that gives you an underwhelming experience. You might as well be using any other model. Um, yeah, I think that's the least interesting of the two stories today that we want to talk about. I'm more curious about the quantum stuff
go
because I
for it.
went down a rabbit hole with that.
Yeah, let's hear
So
it.
Microsoft released a quantum chip, and quantum, whether you know or not, is a big deal for both the AI world and the non-AI world. And the biggest sort of brand name use case is that it can break encryption, right? RSA encryption, where you're basically finding the two prime numbers that make a really big number, your public and private key. It's how the internet is encrypted, the HTTPS protocol. Everything you go to on the internet, it's how it's encrypted, is this RSA 256-bit encryption protocol. And if there are quantum chips with 100,000, a million qubits that are working, um RSA encryption can be broken in some number of years. And there are quantum resistant encryption protocols, but that has not been rolled out in any formal way. There's no transition period or path that has been disclosed by anybody. And Microsoft has just created and released this quantum chip and a full stack coding framework to actually use the chip, which is like the other layer of the problem. But Justin, you've had some experience with D-Wave, another quantum focused company. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I didn't work with them directly, but I still recall thinking it was so cool when a team that I worked on was working with them to help build kind of a productization of kind of like AWS. You would rent space on D-Wave, and D-Wave is one of the long-standing best kind of labs in developing quantum. And I think They're either still first or maybe they're second or third, but in terms of being one of the coldest places on the planet, because to power or to keep things cool with quantum computers because of the heat that they generate, you need to have a very cold place. But point being, I've followed quantum for quite some time, and I think to me the real story here that's cool to me, other than like the hardware is very small for having that many qubits, like it is very impressive. But to me, the big thing is Microsoft putting their weight behind actual development frameworks, because everything that you just brought up about encryption is like, that's cool that it can do that. I mean, maybe not cool because that would lead to a lot of challenges with all encryption breaking. But
Yeah.
point being, the technical capabilities are impressive, but the way that quantum developing, quote unquote, developing, because there's no real like there's not an Airbnb built on quantum or an Uber built on quantum. Like it's not classic software development, and that is the big thing that's held, I think, a lot of people's interest back or caring about quantum. Is that yes, we could have all the qubits and impressive um, physical advances in the world have happen, but the lack of how to build software for it, the way that algorithms work on quantum is inherently different, and the use cases therefore become very limited. Of like, well, what do we use this for? Like most people don't have a use case in cryptography or material science advancements, like the things that quantum on paper could help with. Most companies don't have that use case, and you pair that with a lack of development frameworks where you're not really getting any use out of it, or the potential of it. Then who cares? Kind of thing has been, I think, where a lot of the conversations land is so what. But the advancements this week is pairing two impressive feats, which is the physical advances of having million qubits on something that is the size of a Pop Tart, and then
Yeah.
the investment of Microsoft saying like, let's actually figure out how you build software for this thing, because if you can crack that, then you can get a hell of a lot more done a lot faster than you would on your typical CPU GPU combo.
Yeah, there's three things I'm really excited for with regards to like quantum advancements, particularly. Like, it's gonna cut AI training way down if and when we actually get to a point where there is
Yeah, for the computing.
a JavaScript equivalent for, for qubits and quantum computing. That'll be really interesting because that will kind of accelerate this already ridiculously fast moving train that is AI into the stratosphere. Um, so AI training, I think, will be really great. It'll cut down on the environmental concerns for using AI quite a bit, and just make it be a lot more productive. um, Material sciences. So you can simulate chemistry, interactions and reactions between different chemicals and like create new materials with paired with AI could be really interesting for again environmental use cases to like capture carbon or to build just build the next generation of materials that are going to like make this world a little bit more sustainable. And the
Or
third one
medical
is like
research is a huge one.
yeah, research and biology. Yeah, like
Yeah.
to be able to create the next wave of healthcare, drugs and just innovate in the more physical sense of these industries. Quantum computing is going to enable that to happen a lot faster and kind of on its own because you'll be able to just run simulations to an nth degree that it would be very expensive to do now with traditional computing. So those are three areas that I'm really excited about for quantum, but I do think we're quite a ways away from that actually being relevant. But you know, this past week was like the announcement of, hey, I have this Pop Tart thing that has a bunch of qubits on it, and now you can throw it in a data center, and maybe it'll be useful if people start building using using our new code that will work on these Pop Tart qubits, Pop Tart chips.
Yeah.
uh,
Well, and that's the most impressive part is like that Pop Tart sized chip. Even 5 years ago, let alone 10, would have been the size of, oh God, what's the equivalent? I mean, 10 years ago was the size of a car.
yeah.
5 years ago, it was, the size of your average, call it a couple iPads stacked on top of each other. And
Oh,
now
at
it's
least. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like the last picture of a quantum computer that I looked at was like one of those giant telescopes. It was like that big. But
Yeah, those I think are a lot more qubits in them, but either way, like it's so impressive. The advancements that
yeah,
are happening. Love it. Okay. Well, I feel like that's probably it for this week. I feel like what is it time for?
I think it's time to go back to work. Yeah, I have a couple things I need to do today. I need to go back to work.
Ditto. Okay, well, chat soon. Later.
All right, see ya. Bye bye.